Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 21st episode of Feedback with Yarn Wire. I'm Laura Barger, one of the pianists from Yarn Wire, and today we are so excited to be joined by two incredible guests. Judith Hamann, a cellist that is based in Berlin, I believe. And we also have the wonderful composer Anthony Vine. And today we're going to be talking about Anthony's work for us, Distance Absence, which was featured on Yarn Wire Currents Volume 4. So thanks both of you for joining us today. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Judith.
Hello. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So yes, we're talking about Anthony's piece, Distance Absence, which was written in 2016 for Yarn Wire as part of your Currents series. So I wanted to sort of start with a general hello question for me as well, and to ask how this collaboration came about. So how Yarn Wire and Anthony connected to start working on this collaboration.
I'm trying to think back to it. I think because you were living out in Ridgewood, not in Ridgewood, but you were in Queens, I think, when we met, right?
Yeah, I was living in Bushwick, right on the border of Ridgewood.
That's right. Let's not get our boroughs mixed up here.
Yeah.
I think, you know what? Now I remember. I was hanging with Oyvind Torvund, who we are going to have on this show at some point. And Oyvind was like, hey, do you know Anthony Vine? That's not really how Oyvind talks at all. Invitation for some reason. And he said, have you heard Anthony's music? Because I think he might have heard it at Gaudiamus maybe, or something. Or maybe you knew him. Anyway, Oyvind told me to check your music out. And I did. And then we got in touch, and I think it went from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, Oyvind and I surprisingly have only met in person once. And it was right before the premiere of his piece written for you guys at Issue Project Room. But before that, we had just had this email correspondence because I had heard this amazing piece of his Neon Forest Space at Darmstadt quite a while ago. And, you know, in the mix of the just sort of like overwhelmingness that is Darmstadt, his piece just really stuck out to me, and I just corresponded with him. And so we've kind of exchanged music here and there throughout the years and kept in touch. So yeah, it's a cool connection.
Yeah, it is nice. It's nice that, like, yeah, I mean, all these different connections are made, and just like it's down to people like saying, hey, check this out, you know. Mm-hmm. I thought that's and it was nice that you lived close by to where our studio was. That helped.
Is that generally how these kind of Currents collaborations come about, through like a hunch or like following someone's particular music? And do you decide it collectively?
Yeah, it really varies a lot. I would say, I mean, there's anything from the person that we have gotten to know sort of maybe in our circle, maybe in New York, or through a circle connection, sort of like Anthony, a friend of a friend who becomes later a friend of ours, or people that we've admired kind of from afar and have sort of built relationships with as the pieces and the projects come together. And in terms of, the collective, I think if one of us has a really strong feeling about someone, the rest of us are usually not far behind in terms of getting on board. Would you say that's right, Russell?
I think so. I can't really think of any exceptions. I mean, sometimes maybe each of us has gotten nixed now and again, but I don't think so. I think it's usually like, hey, this would be cool. All right, let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, just so that everyone knows what we're actually talking about here, I should probably introduce the piece. So here is the front page of the score, and we should have a short video clip queued up so that we can have a little look/listen at some of the music before we get too deep in. Okay, so I know tiny little snippet, but just so we get a sense maybe of what we're going to get into. So I wanted to start talking first about instrumentation and embodied and disembodied sound in this piece. Because listening to this piece a lot over the last little while, which I've been doing, it feels to me like there's a tension in it between embodied sound making, as in sound that's connected to the body, and sounds whose origins are less identifiable or maybe even unidentifiable, and that the instrumentation of the piece itself kind of holds these ideas in a concrete way. So I wanted to start first by asking about the percussion, specifically the metals for this piece. And maybe to Anthony first, in terms of like how they were chosen, and then to Jan Weyer, was there a contribution in that decision making, or was it a collaborative process to choose those specific instruments?
Yeah, I can start. I guess when thinking about this piece, I was really interested in trying to draw on the like acoustical interaction between all these different warped and differently tuned metals and steel strings, and like that was sort of like the basis of the palette that I wanted to work with. And so at the beginning of the process, I remember coming to the studio a couple times and working with Russell in particular and sort of accumulating this sort of archive of recordings from their instrumentarium, like these wonky Almglocken that had like funky overtones, and like sort of the fundamental pitch sometimes didn't really necessarily match what was actually being played, and like all these different metal tubes and small gongs and things like that, and just kind of like taking record of all of these things and really immersing myself in these sounds. And like over the course of time, I was sort of like transcribing these sounds, just sort of playing around with them as samples, looping them, and sort of creating chords that integrated with that different metallic percussion, and trying to find ways to like foreground, I guess, these like really particular behaviors that each little instrument had. And so I think you're right, Judith, that the instrumentation and the sort of like material of the piece, the specific instrumentation, are in this like really interconnected type of relationship.
Yeah, I'm curious to ask Russell, perhaps, like, was that kind of interaction in terms of your instruments as well, like as in like not necessarily like you as a percussionist instruments, but your specific instruments that are sort of individually yours. Did that play a role in that kind of development of material?
I feel like in relation to this piece, for sure, because Anthony did come to the studio, right? And there's always this interaction between myself and a composer, and in particular this time, where we show beautiful instruments that we like to play, and hide the ones that don't sound so good. So I think in that way, yes, we're like very sure that these sounds are going to be good. There's a little bell plate that made it in, right, in this piece? Mm-hmm. That was funny because we didn't have any bell plates, but we had this little tiny, like, kind of aluminum thing that we had been trying to get used. And I think that's how that came about. It was just like, yeah, this thing is that pitch. Cool, let's put it in. We haven't used it. And we still haven't used it in anything, to be honest. So, having the materials be our own really makes a piece feel comfortable. We know how to interact with the things. And then it feels, there's some kind of ownership, I feel like, when the piece, you know how to make the sounds already.
I had heard that there was, in fact, speaking of the like not very good instruments that maybe you hide in the cupboard, that actually in this piece, like it was those like kind of like the wonkiest instruments that sort of ended up being part of the palette of material.
It happens.
So did Anthony like dig around and like find like the strangest Armglocken you have, or how does that work?
Well, Armglocken by their nature are just going to be not in tune, and same with tuned gongs. I mean, we could like fine tune with a little putty or something, but they're just really not going to ever be in tune. And I think Anthony was drawn to that because it kind of then opens up like our equal temperament, right? And then kind of makes things a little bit more interesting sonically. And you hear that, I think, in the piano writing too, where like there are things done so that we're not just dealing with the same kind of, tuning all the time. It's an issue with the ensemble, but ways around it acoustically are, by using these naturally detuned metals.
Yeah, I guess it's like one of those things where it could be an issue or it could be a strength, kind of depending on what your conception of in tune is or what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I remember being I feel like I just sort of took stock of everything that was there on some level, obviously attracted to some things more than others, but really finding that and playing with those samples, the ones with these little abnormalities, strong differences between like an instrument being struck and bowed, and like things where it felt like the instruments were a little bit unstable in terms of what you were going to get, like things where the overtones would sort of flicker or flourish in sort of unforeseen ways, were things that I was drawn to. And then, I also added my own like sort of personal instruments to the palette as well. I purchased this zither from a music store in New York that was kind of, cracked in the middle and not necessarily, like, I guess was used as a sort of movie prop, if I remember correctly. And, oh yeah.
Influenced us since, I have to say. It's mainstay.
Yeah, I remember seeing it in the Marianne Amiche piece that you guys performed in.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And so, this kind of instrument whose tuning was always like slipping, and, I sort of tuned the instrument and gave it to you guys, but with no instruction as to like how it should be tuned. And I'm sort of like interested in this idea of, I don't know, these things as being these objects that have a sort of life of their own and sort of deteriorate and evolve and change a little bit as the thing goes on. And just these instruments that seem to have like really distinct characteristics. Like I remember Russell, like right before the piece was going to be performed, one of the Omglocken, I don't know, there was a discrepancy between like how it was notated and how it was actually sounding. And you were like, oh, I'm going to rent in this particular Omglocken so that we can get the correct pitch. And I was like, no. Like the whole point is like that all these sonorities are really built around the particularities of how that instrument is tuned.
I love that idea that like the material and the instruments themselves and the sort of personalities of the instruments themselves sort of become part of the ensemble and the material of the piece. And I wanted to ask about another kind of key material in this piece, which I guess is related, which is the cassette players for sine tones. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask about the kind of choice of analog as opposed to digital. And also I think it's very interesting that it's electronics that are triggered by the performers of the ensemble instead of, you know, being extended outwards as this like digital thing. But I guess I'm kind of curious to talk a little bit about like what orchestrating electronics in this way, both as an analog thing and as like part of the ensemble instrumentation sets in motion, like sonically and physically.
Yeah, I use cassette tapes quite a bit in a lot of different pieces. And, you know, the reason for this isn't necessarily to like conjure nostalgia or anything like that, but sort of similar to how I was describing some of the metallic percussion things that I was attracted to. The tapes themselves have these sort of fallibilities where the tapes sort of deteriorate over time. There's weird hiccups that happen when you're trying to record particular sounds on them. Sometimes they, you know, sort of swoop in terms of their speed and like then gradually settle down. There's all these different, you know, shifts in the sort of mechanisms that I think give then the electronics, which in this piece are just pure waveforms, very kind of sterile, static, simple sounds. And it sort of gives them some dynamic qualities. And I also feel like it makes them a little bit more human, like they are just like an active performer within the ensemble. So they kind of change from performance to performance. And also like the placement of the sound source and position, I think is very important for me. I know that like as a guitarist, whenever I use a sort of like drone or like backing track to something that I'm doing, I absolutely hate when the electronics are coming out of speakers that are sort of flanked to my side, or there's this monitor and I don't really understand what the mix is. You're just kind of guessing and like hoping the sound engineer is doing something right. And by having these sources within the ensemble, I think creates like a different type of engagement and blend and interaction with the electronics that you might not have in other contexts. For instance, in this piece, they're triggering the cassette tapes with these like foot pedals. And so there's like a very just like active interaction, more dynamic sort of interaction with the electronics that I'm trying to seek out.
And Janweier, folks, does it feel that way to you too? Like having the electronics integrated into the ensemble is like an instrument or an action?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's something that this idea of agency that we have in a piece like this, where we are really controlling what is essentially a very simple mechanism. It's just an on-off switch that you hit with your foot or your hand in some situations, I think, when logistically necessary. But yeah, it's a lot more tactile and hands-on sometimes than electronics that are in a computer and you just press play and then everything that happens, even if you're starting and stopping the sound, somehow you don't feel as connected to it. It's more separate. And so, yeah, it's really, as someone who strives to be more technologically competent, but has not reached that goal. Maybe I really enjoy that about this piece, that ability to sort of be connected to it.
I do. I like that too, because you know, it's very easy to like make a max patch and have it, well, not easy, but you know, and have it just like
Yeah.
run back, and then it's, oh, someone else is taking care of that. But like when you use like guitar pedals or any kind of pedal physically, you know, then it becomes both your responsibility but also your sound. You know, even though like it's pre-recorded and stuff, it's like I'm making that thing, and I have to put an action in the music. And I think that yeah, it connects us to it more than if it was just like some, you know, back of house, you know,
Yeah.
thing.
And also it sort of makes it sort of integrated into the performance in a way that it doesn't if someone else or like another kind of system, like in terms of like monitors or another engineer, it becomes sort of like in-house in terms of like the performance in a way.
Totally. Yeah.
I wanted to play another little clip of the opening section and ask some more questions about instrumentation after we've seen that.
Great.
Great. So this opening feels to me, with the very important kind of exception of the bowed piano, that all the material forms this one composite sound mass. And there isn't a sense of, say, like individual voices. It's just this kind of pure sine tone, crotales, harmonic texture. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about this kind of sound mass or composite thing in the piece, and maybe start by asking Anthony, is this something you're interested in more broadly in your composition, this kind of like a conglomerate sound or non-identifiability of sound sources?
Yeah, definitely. I think this goes along with that theme you introduced at the beginning of the disembodied, embodied kind of dialectic here. But yeah, composing for me is very much a process of, it's very much guided by this process of blurring and obscuring the identities of the instruments I'm working with, and sort of striving for this degree of sourcelessness, which is a term that Feldman uses quite a bit, and I feel like I really identify with that. And so, like in this piece, I'm sort of trying to find these ways of overlaying all of these self-similar types of sound objects, these metals and like piano sonorities that correspond with those metals, zithers, you know, sine waves that sort of integrate with the sinusoidal resonance of everything, and all of these sort of just become, you know, interwoven, these like entangled resonances of all these different sources, and trying to find these ways to create, a singular, interconnected, and monolithic kind of composite of sound. And I feel like I don't really prioritize this for like some sort of illusionary sort of effect, but I'm really interested in removing the identities of instruments to sort of engage or to sort of offer a type of of listening, I guess, that's like more focused a bit on acoustical phenomena and sort of listening to resultant tones and psychoacoustic effects and sort of foregrounding that sort of stuff rather than saying, hey, there's this instrument doing this particular thing. It's more about like this larger overarching sonority.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask, and maybe this is in some way like antithetical to what you were trying to do, but one of my favorite things about the very opening is the bowed piano as like an exception to that disembodiment, and like it's this humanness and the awkwardness of the like starting and stopping of the sound, and that it has like this raspiness and roughness to it. Like it disrupts the sense that it's this kind of like disembodied, that people aren't participating in the manufacture of the sound, that there's like a body and arms involved in this. And I wanted to ask Laura, maybe because you were the one bowing the piano, whether like that was part of it in any way, or it's just kind of like an artifact of like that action.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about it is an awkward technique, bowing piano. Somehow like doing it for any extended amount of time is strangely extremely physically tiring. I've noticed, maybe it's just also as I get a little older, things like that become more physically tiring. But no, I think that idea of you're right. When we were watching that video, I hadn't really thought about it that way until I was noticing just the pure gesture, this like back and forth. And I remember the high string on the piano. It's also really sometimes difficult to get it to speak as well as some of those nice big long low strings. And so I was really having to like work for it, kind of, make sure it was really good and sticky and rosined. So yeah, there is this sort of it's a different energy producing that sound that comes out, as opposed to everything else. Even though I think Russell, was it you that's bowing the crotale? That's also a pretty intense, like physical motion, but maybe more expected from a percussionist rather than a pianist. Yeah.
I just love that also, even sonically, that it's like that sound as well is in itself a composite, because even when you're producing that super pure high tone that contributes to this like overall composite resonance, there's this unintended kind of extra sound that comes like just from like the physicality of the performer. And I guess I was just curious whether that like, Anthony, are you thinking about like performers' physicality like when you're composing, or is it more kind of are the sounds kind of existing in a kind of more utopian ideal?
No, I think I am thinking a lot about the physicality of performance, and I just thinking about that excerpt we listened to. I also find that, for instance, even the harmonicas that are being played, there's this kind of roughness throughout this nice like sort of stream of sound in terms of like the onset, but also just like how it blooms and like how somebody's particular breath in that moment sort of like carves out this, I would imagine, like pretty unique expression every single time that that phrase occurs. And that these sorts of instabilities, this sort of fragility that's inherent in the actual performance technique is what gives like a lot of expressivity to the music itself. It's things that aren't notated in the score. If you look at the score, it's just whole notes, sort of tied together, and it would look like it would be just very streamlined and static. But there's just all this sort of dynamic sorts of energy, I think, in the piece that really come from the physicality of performance. And I think for myself personally, I can't remember back to this piece, but I often am really trying to engage in what it feels like to actually do some of these actions, and have usually done them myself and recorded them. And so I feel like I'm very conscious of what it takes to make that sound, and what that kind of could mean sort of emotionally or physically in that moment of performance.
Great. Yeah, I love this idea, as Anthony probably knows, of the score kind of setting a performance in motion, but not necessarily dictating the full kind of spectrum of what that might be. And it sort of feels like a lot of this piece really brings that to the foreground in many ways, that there's sort of these kind of these actions set in motion by the score, but then in the execution of the task, all this other material and richness and sort of blurriness and the all kind of gets set in motion. And I guess I'm kind of curious what it's like being inside that for Yarnwire, or there's only two of you to answer that question today, but whether you experience that when you're performing the piece, or what it is to be kind of inside this kind of ambiguous sound source where maybe you can't actually necessarily identify what other people in the ensemble are doing, or am I making that sound, or is that person making that sound? How does the kind of as performers, how do you kind of get situated within that kind of experience, sonically as well?
I remember the opening of this piece very well. We don't know who was doing what. And I think the first time we did it, I think Ning, her tape player, all comes in at some point, with a high note. And we're always like, Ning, are you playing? It's just in there. And then you're like, what? So you just don't know what's happening. And that was challenging. And then the rest of the piece plays with these ideas in certain ways, and it's really challenging to know, especially with the tapes, who's triggering what, where it's coming from. And so the way around it is through a tool we usually use, and that's moving. We call him Bob. He's our fifth member. So Bob came to this gig, thankfully. And he helped us out, to navigate it. But the more you play it, the more then you can start pinpointing where everything's coming from, But that initial encounter is, I hope, how an audience would hear it, where they're just I don't know what's going on,
I love that. That's great. I love the idea that over time, you become kind of more fluent in what that kind of disorientation is as well, as an ensemble. I wanted to ask one last question about instrumentation, which is to Anthony about the harmonicas, actually, because I know that this is a sort of recurring instrumentation for you, something that you use in other pieces. And I just wanted to ask, what is it about the harmonica that keeps bringing it back?
Yeah. I sort of stumbled upon the harmonicas. I think a roommate of mine had a set of chromatic harmonicas, and I'm a big Bob Dylan fan too, so all of these things sort of collided in this moment. And over the years I've integrated harmonicas into a lot of different pieces, and I feel like my goal, I guess, is to sort of present them in these new context with every single iteration. But really, I'm very concerned and drawn towards like the sort of rich overtones of the harmonicas, that sort of reediness, but especially in the upper register, which I draw upon a lot in this piece. The sounds are very sinusoidal. And so I think that they mesh super well with like these different types of very high, like resonant frequencies that are happening throughout. But also what's interesting is like in that upper register of the harmonica, there are super, super clear combination tones. It's like one of the probably ideal instruments to sort of like demonstrate that kind of acoustical phenomena. And so getting that sort of acoustical complexity is just sort of like readily available with the harmonica. And I think that's generally why I'm quite drawn towards them.
And Yanwar, is this something that happens? I mean, you're percussionist, especially percussionist. This happens a lot where it's just like, okay, so you're also going to play this. Was this your first time using harmonicas in a piece, or no? This is like something that crops up like all the time.
This isn't all the time. I mean, not
in all the pieces. It's not as much as like Super Ball, for example. It's not that ubiquitous, but
yeah,
definitely
that's just a cliche.
Yeah, it's Super Ball, pick, harmonica.
And like a 1, 2, 3.
It happens, but it happens enough, but it so it's not scary. But you know, people use them to different degrees. I think, you know, I've used it enough now that I have a harmonica mount, let's just say. But that comes from a Ligeti piece, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's, you know, it's there. But yeah, I think this was a much more detailed harmonica part than we've ever done. Like we have our bag of Vine harmonicas.
Aww.
It says Vine.
Yeah, actually, I've sort of given away harmonicas to a variety of ensembles. I think everyone has a set of Vine harmonicas now.
Nice.
I like this as a legacy. The Vine harmonicas. Yeah, collections all over the place.
Yeah, we may have to auction them off sometime, but you know.
I wanted to move on to talking a bit about more of the middle section of the piece, which is a bit more rhythmic and active, I guess, in certain ways. But perhaps it's best if we just roll a little clip of that so that people can get a bit sonically situated before we talk about it. Great. So I wanted to start by sort of talking in a little bit more detail about the kind of like process that led towards this kind of idea of blur or smear in this piece. And I think it's really interesting to me how much that's sort of active, even in this section that's like very rhythmically precise and involves a lot of striking, how there's still this kind of like blur and cross smear between the instruments, like even within that kind of rate of activity. And I was curious to ask a little bit about the kind of like harmonic material, which I guess we sort of touched on a little bit at the beginning when we were talking about instrumentation. But Anthony, you described part of your process in composing this piece to me, where you were talking about that you transcribed by ear the recordings that you'd made of Russell and Ian's metal instruments. And you were saying that by transcribing like the pitches and harmonic spectra that you could hear by ear, you were interested in that kind of being a process of limiting, or that you were exploring the kind of fallibility of your own hearing or perception of pitch. And as a performer who's like also like quite interested in the space that failure opens up in terms of like particularly like European classical music structures, like I'm really intrigued actually by the idea that you're sort of setting up here, that this is operating in relation to listening specifically. And I guess I tend to think about these things much more in terms of like the perspective of the performer. So about like physicality and materiality of the instrument. But I wonder, like, Anthony, could you talk a little bit about this idea of like failure as an approach to kind of like listening and transcription, and how that kind of constructs, I guess, like, to me it seems like a kind of like sieving, like a sieve of material or harmony?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like I said earlier, I, recorded these sounds and really just immersed myself in them, and in a way was just sort of playing with all of these different samples and just getting these sonorities in my ear. And then there became a time where I realized, okay, I need to kind of notate what I'm hearing here and start to like work with this as material. And a lot of that involved just this very sort of like hands-on experiential sort of engagement of just listening, trying to figure out what it was I was hearing, notating that, playing around some more, coming back, realizing maybe there was a little mistake here. I'm hearing something different now. And just sort of like letting the limitations and capacities of my hearing create this very like deeply personal signature in terms of like how I was thinking about these like harmonic composites, and sort of letting like the sort of sloppiness and quirks and fallibility of my transcription process like enter into the music, rather than like a software which might give a very, matter-of-fact result from one person to the next, right, with the same sample. That this like very particular type of listening with all of just like my limitations, like, yeah, I don't know, just created this like very particular type of sonority in the piece that sort of like highlights whatever it is that I am sort of locked into or honed in on. And the same as with the piano chords, was just sort of like finding these particular sonorities that I felt really seamlessly integrated with the percussion, and just sort of like really following my intuition in that way. And like sort of inviting in like all of the weird slippages that happen when you like sort of align all of these seemingly matched objects together, and just sort of letting those unfold and see what happens.
I love this idea of like failure as like a generative listening filtration process. I think that's like a really beautiful way to kind of like lead into this space of like ambiguous sound source and this kind of like blurriness of chord and instrument. And I was curious whether for you guys, Laura and Russell, as performers, like how much of that sort of felt clear that there was this kind of like very specific pitch set that kind of blurred or moved around between the group in the performance? Particularly, I guess I'm curious about this these more active like middle sections.
Yeah, I do remember talking about, some of these things in rehearsal, with Anthony, and that the section that we were listening to and that we're talking about, that's like the effect is so, for me, is so effective, for lack of a better word, because there is all of this blur, but then there are these like notes, these almost like bell tones that keep insisting in the piano part, that keep coming through, and it's like those are almost like a reminder of what all of that melded, cloudy, beautiful, mushy, washy sound that's happening in the rest of the ensemble, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like this is a piano.
Yeah.
Just in case you forgot
right,
for a
right.
second there.
Yeah.
That kind of leads me into like the next thing that I wanted to ask about, which is I wanted to ask about the idea of after sound in relation to this kind of section, or I guess also it's sort of a general question, I guess, for people who play instruments that involve some kind of striking. There's this like a great quote from Alvin Lucier when he's talking about Feldman's piano's works as being like a kind of analog electronics, that the piano without the attack becomes this kind of like pure after sound, like an electronic sound. And I love that like we're also talking about the fact that like maintaining the strike like maintains the identity of the instrument, but the after sound kind of melds with the sine tones and the cassettes and like all this kind of like blurriness, and that there's this relationship there between like the action of the strike and the resonance. And I know that even Anthony, because you're also a performer composer on using guitar, so I guess all of you interact with instruments which are struck, and I guess I was just curious how this piece kind of like situates different relationships between strike and response, or like does it actually sort of create settings where attack and decay and the resonance inform like the pacing or the ensemble or the interpretation even of like tempi and execution? Sorry, that was kind of like several questions in one.
I'll just pop in real quick. I'm realizing, I mean, you don't have this experience because like really our whole musical experience is to, you do it and it happens, like, right? With the exception of like bowing a vibes or something like that, as opposed to like a string instrument necessarily, where like there's other modes of production. You know, I'm vastly simplifying it, obviously, but in this piece, what's challenging is like, again, listening to that past excerpt, there are moments where I remember, Anthony, you have us like keep hitting stuff, right, to like sustain it. That's really hard, first of all. So we do the best we can with it. I'm not going to say we're entirely successful, but the piece is like this surface for me is this like gently moving surface that's very smooth. But underneath that, like what's creating that smoothness are these attacks, right? And then like moments like with Laura's piano chords and stuff like that. And so as a percussionist, maintaining those two layers is really challenging. But when I can get out of the music and like listen to it here in these examples, you start hearing what's happening. And it's really, I mean, it's pretty awesome. But it's like, I just remember that first performance and it's just like, I got to know where I am in my music, because now I'm reading these things and it's like, it's a lot going on. Yeah. I don't know how it is for piano though, Laura.
Yeah. No, I think what you're describing is really similar. Just, I mean, the nature of the piano. I mean, I think Judith, your comment sent me on this sort of like tangent in my brain of thinking about what it would sound like if somebody took all the iconic works of piano literature and like removed the attack from every note. Like, what would that sound like? Somebody's probably done that somewhere.
This sounds like a project.
I still have that level of technological competency first that I have to achieve before I get to that level. But no, I agree with so much of what Russell said. Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess I was also curious, not sort of like with the awareness that this is something you do like all the time, the like strike and listening. But I guess I was curious, like how much of it is like, is the next in this piece is sort of like where you place that next chord. Is that based on like the resonance and decay, or is it sort of like an external kind of like temporal? Is it pulse driven or is it responsive?
I think it's pulse driven in this. We are working in a time signature. I think this definitely Bob was integral in this section as well. So inelegant, but really so true. Especially when you're thinking back to a premiere or first performance. But yeah, no, I think in general it's dependent on the situation, and also the thing about piano is playing with percussion really brings out our percussive qualities, because as pianists we learn to sort of fake our way around the instrument, and when we play with instruments that have bloom, like string instruments or wind instruments, we learn ways to sort of like ease into the sound, or kind of just to sort of at least de-accentuate the percussive qualities. But with percussion, can't really do that. I mean, we have to accentuate all of those attacks. And so I think then the temporal element becomes as important as possible, so that even if things happen to be occurring in a pulseless section, there still has to be some way of deciding like where attacks happen and how we coordinate that with each other.
Yeah, I guess this is also like totally one of those things where like being inside the performance of the piece can be like so different to kind of like the external perception, or something like when you've got like a pop song at like 24 BPM, like just like stabilize like how you like get through like certain parts. Mm-hmm. Like I'm curious about like how much like rhythm or pulse kind of like is involved in like this piece, like compositionally, or also performatively, even if it's sort of like secret and internal.
Yeah, how did you think about it, Anthony? I mean, I know how we had to like logistically do it, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I think that this sort of pulse and these guiding tempos and these sort of time signatures that sort of keep the thing together and propel the musical texture forward are definitely like subterranean type of things for me. And that the hope is that one doesn't really feel that per se when listening, but actually it's sort of a little bit like something you described earlier, Russell, but it's just this kind of like terrain that's like unfolding and sort of like very subtly sort of undulating. And like Laura was saying, these just sort of like bursts of sonorities that kind of like poke through like that. And the whole thing should feel, I would hope, to be a little bit nebulous in terms of like a pulse or something, that it's really just this, I think of it as this terrain, like this just ground with like little stones or something along it. But to like create that and make that hold together, there has to be this like, whatever, like this, this subterranean like layer that keeps everyone aligned on some level and organized. And listening back and sort of re-engaging with this piece after quite a while, I remember like, sort of looking at the score and feeling like, I think there are probably more effective ways to like notate some of that material in these faster passages that would, I don't know, match more of like the sort of performance logic and then like what's the listening experience. And I feel like that's something I've been thinking about and sort of working at a lot very recently. In this piece, there's kind of like this disjunct, I think, between that, where everyone here is like thinking, okay, I got to get this like perfectly aligned, and like we're all together, and there's like this choreography associated with like piecing that together. And yeah, finding like notational strategies and things like that can sort of like free up and allow you to sort of take it in a little bit, and maybe, like what Judith was saying, have a more responsive relationship with the material. the reverberation and the resonance and things like that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask like one quick question about the score. We probably don't have that much more time actually, but I think notation is such an interesting thing in terms of like this like bridge between composer and performer and listener, or you know, not necessarily bridge. It's not necessarily two-way. It can be like, you know, some kind of elaborate prism perhaps, or other kind of 3 or 4 dimensional shape. But I think like the interface of notation, like it speaks to so many layers in terms of like it's a text, and then it's like about decoding, but it's also about sort of like assignments of control, or like in terms of like Anthony, what you said before, that it's not about this power thing of like you must kind of like obey, or like, you know, fidelity to the score and things like that. And I was curious that there's a lot of like image-based directions in the score, like Anthony, where you have like performance indications like hollow glow or pillars with shadows. And I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit to the relationship of image and text in this piece.
Yeah, I think that these are just sort of like personal marginalia to me, like these little poetic images that just sort of spontaneously come to me as I'm writing the piece, or sometimes I just add them as I'm sort of like finalizing the score, or I'm listening back and just like thinking about different ideas. And like I feel like I'm a very sort of visual listener, that like when I listen to my own music and conceptualize it, but I also listen to others, I'm like sort of thinking in sort of shapes and like using visual metaphors a lot to just sort of like come to terms and understand what's going on in a piece of music. And so I sort of leave these things in the score to perhaps impart a very particular like aesthetic or atmospheric kind of approach to performing or thinking about or listening to the music. But I never really like talk about them in rehearsal. I just sort of leave them in there and, you know, see what happens. And yeah, but I mean, also these visual descriptions correspond with a lot of just structural and formal ideas that I'm having. For instance, there's a lot of descriptions in the score about grids, which is this guiding sort of image or structure that I use throughout the writing process, where I was like sort of conceptualizing like these more active sections that we listen to as this like geometric kind of mesh, these networks of overlapping lines that weave in and out of one another. So that's like kind of my thoughts on the visual imagery in the score.
Yeah, you sent me these beautiful images of curtains in New Mexico where you like completed the piece that was sort of these like amazing grid structures that are kind of like Ellsworth Kelly-ish almost. Like was there like a distinct visual relationship or relationship between like the visual grid and like the formal structure?
Well, I think the curtains were a sort of serendipitous thing where I'd already been like working with material that in a way had this analog with this site that I just like happened to be sort of like polishing and like finishing this piece. And very evocative. But I was just thinking about like the Ellsworth Kelly idea was sort of like an afterthought about this piece for me, like thinking about like the overall like formal structure of the piece and how it feels like a little bit disjunct. And this particular painting, I think it's made in this really incredible way where it's like he started with this seamless sort of like fluid connected image and then just sort of cut different parts of it and pasted it together. And I think the overall like structure of this piece, I think, draws upon that kind of a sensibility of this, continuum of various materials that are then just sort of like blocked out and like put in different sorts of orders that are a little bit surprising, I guess, and like not the sort of like typical logic that I would use to compose a piece.
Yeah, like it's not like all one shape. It sort of gets shifted in a way.
Right.
We should wrap up in a moment, but I have one burning question, which is in the original score at the end of the piece, you have Jan Weyer meant to hum, and for a reason that I don't know, there is no humming in the piece. So I just have to ask, what happened to the humming? Why didn't it make it?
I think we're not very good at humming.
That's all?
I think
Right.
After all our discussions about failure and
I think it might have had to do a lot with the venue where we premiered is Pioneer Works in Red Hook, Brooklyn, and it's so massive and huge.
it is massive.
And I think, especially as mostly untrained singers, or at least out of practice trained singers, we didn't have the advanced humming technique to a point where we could really project it, and it just wasn't being heard.
That's true. We couldn't project at all. That's right. But I'm and we didn't want to mic it because things would be
That's
really
really
weird.
different. Yeah.
What if we did it with kazoos?
Great. I love
All
this
right.
revision.
I look forward to the time that you perform this in a smaller venue and the humming can be potentially reintroduced.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know, my memory of it is a little different. I kind of thought that actually the humming was too present, and that I wanted it to be this more sort of disembodied sound, similar to the sine tones, where there's this, apparitional like layer of something there that at times is just kind of like creating this glow within the piece, but you don't really recognize it as like a distinct sound or a source or a layer necessarily in the piece. It's sort of like sitting on the periphery. And I thought the humming was just in that context, like way too present. It was too clear that it was humming, that it was too clear that it was like a vocalization. And
The other way.
yeah, that's my memory of it, but
Yeah.
Still our fault.
Still our
yes.
fault.
Well, you folks are going to have to have this out amongst yourselves. Which version of the humming chop is accurate. But I think that might be all we have time for today. So
I know.
Thank you so much. I'll hand
Yeah.
it back to you, Laura.
Well, thanks to you, Anthony, and thanks, Judith, for joining us. This is such a fantastic conversation and a good example of, it almost, the time flies. We could go on for hours. It feels like it's so wonderful to talk about this music and to remember and to even maybe come up with these new ideas too for future performances. So our next episode of Feedback is coming up on Tuesday, November 10th. We'll be chatting with composer Michelle Liu and Jenny Gottschalk. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss an episode. And also, if you get a chance, go check out our page on patreon.com where you can support Feedback. And in exchange, we've put together a whole bunch of cool stuff that you get as rewards, like the coveted Yarnwire tote bag, personalized ringtones that Russell and I have made for your ringing pleasure. So please support this project. We need all the help we can get. And thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.